Well, welcome back, everybody, to Between Two Sermons. Rob Cattalani, thanks for joining me in my office.
Glad to be here. Iamaio,
yeah.
glad to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We are walking through the book of 1 Corinthians together, and we have landed in chapter 6, and we have one word for the day, Rob. Sex.
Yes.
There we go.
Yeah.
Who says we don't talk about it in church?
That's
we
right.
did, or you did.
did.
I didn't have to. I didn't have to handle this one. Rob did all the work on this.
Your
one.
turn's coming.
That's right. But anyway, so Rob, you brought up this passage for us, one that is kind of awkward to talk through as a communicator, right?
Yeah.
But as you look back on that passage and you think through everything that you kind of help navigate us through, what stands out as one of the key principles that you're like, I really hope people connect with this one and it sticks with them?
I'll come up with two quickly. One is the which I hope I'm getting through in all these messages, is the importance of getting the gospel right. It's called The Gospel in Relationships. Last fall series was called, Seeing All of Life Through the Gospel. And Paul even starts, you might say, a lot of times we get the gospel, it's not wrong or right, we get it partly right.
Right.
And they say, all things are lawful for me. And then Paul says, but be careful, not everything is beneficial. You don't want to be mastered by something, in this case sexual sin. But I think some would say that when they're saying that, although Paul is quoting them, some say they are quoting Paul, just like a kid would do. Dad, you always say this.
Yeah.
And then the parent has to say, you got it out of context, or it doesn't apply in every area. So some would say that Paul, because he was so committed to the grace of the gospel, had been saying to this congregation, you're free from the law. And he probably did say that. Yeah. And so my first point I would want people to appreciate, John, is that the gospel is something we have to look into all of our lives. Peter says the angels look into it and they still don't fully appreciate it. They still have a sense of wonder in Peter's epistle about the depths and breadths of the gospel. So one is, as we look at this book, whether we're talking about sex, which is what we were talking about in these couple weeks, what is the implications of the gospel? Right. So that's number one. I think the other thing that stands out for me is, I think my second point was sex is more than skin deep. And I really think that's what I think I want people to know, whether you are married, and we'll talk even more about this coming up this next week, how sex is more than skin deep. It's simply an expression of a much deeper union, right? It's a way to express a union. And for those people, both in marriage who are tempted outside of marriage, but especially perhaps to a lot of single people or non-married people who have a sense of there's a sexual need that people have. It's part of being a human being, but what is actually going on? So I think that's what I think that's what I hear Paul most saying in this passage is they were having, it was a culture that was very obsessed in some ways with sex. It was very much a part of the culture in various and sundry ways. And I think Paul, more than just saying, do this, don't do that, he's trying to say, let's get a theology or a working, deeper understanding of how God has designed it. I think that was what most stood out to me.
Yeah. I think you did a really good job of painting that picture for us. You talked a lot about the idea of the body as a temple. So even beyond the idea of sexuality, our bodies are temples, and how Paul uses that illustration there. What I think is fascinating in my experience with church is sometimes I feel like what the church has done has reacted to society and flipped it the opposite way. So like in a sex-obsessed culture,
let's be unsex obsessed.
Let's just not talk about it.
Right.
Or let's kind of paint it as okay, but not really paint a holistic picture of it.
Yeah.
I think you were trying to fight against that way of operating as you were communicating this.
I think, And sometimes the challenge of teaching the Bible is, you get a chunk at a time, and you don't get the whole picture, the whole story of Joseph in one sermon, as as an example. So I think as we move into chapter 7, Paul will say, actually, sex is a beautiful thing that God has purposed, that has tremendous potentials for joy and even an expression of love. And you might say the Bible, the Apostle Paul, God, the Father of all this, is very pro-sex.
Right.
So you're right. I think in this one chapter, it did come out too in chapter 6, but because he was addressing, you might say, an inappropriate, a dangerous, and a harmful way of expressing sex, that is with prostitutes.
Right.
That I even felt after, that, gee, was I too, was it too heavy, too negative? That was not my heart. But I think the passage Paul's trying to say, almost like you would do with a kid, you're challenging them on something, maybe a child, on something that they're doing wrong, but often they're just doing it's what they're doing. There's nothing wrong with what they're doing. It's just the way in which they're using it or doing it. You're watching too much TV. You're not spending enough time where you need to. And I think it's one of those things where Paul is certainly not saying sex is bad. And I think the church has been guilty of that in its history, because it doesn't know what to do with a sex-obsessed culture.
Yeah.
And I think Paul's trying, in one sense, to say, let's talk about these realities that you're all facing, the temptations and the behaviors that can be self-defeating and self-destructive. But let's also, even in this challenging passage, for this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, and the two shall become one flesh. That one statement which he quotes, he's parachuting in this very positive statement about the theology of sex, even in this sermon that's addressing a strange behavior, an inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, so what you're doing, I sense, in this is trying to convey the ultimate beauty of what sex is, because it involves all of us as people. So for some of us, when we even hear that word sex, like, we instinctively have this reaction internally.
Right.
And there's not many other words that's true. That we respond to that way.
Yeah.
And I think even there's something even in that.
Yeah.
That we respond that way to it.
Yeah.
Because it does touch every piece of who we are.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think one of the strongest, I don't know if emotion's the right word, that we have negative emotions is shame, not just around sex, but around anything. Right. The way we look, the way we make our way in the world, our career, whatever, but certainly sex. So I think my sense is, Christian or non-Christian, but the church has its own imperfect experience, that sex, the people hearing the word, now hearing it in the context of, let's say, a church sermon, I would imagine one of the first thoughts, I don't know this for a fact, that people think of, they go down that negative road.
Right.
This is a shame experience. No one wants to feel shame.
Right.
And for whatever reason, whether it's the church did this or the church just contributes to it, people associate sex with shame.
Yeah.
And so that's a reality we just have to recognize and do our best, if we can, we get more than one crack at it, to not avoid it for that reason, but to try to have a healthy conversation. Yeah. And I think, I'm sure this was true in Corinth, and we'll see even as the study goes further, it kind of goes from one extreme to the other, from sex is okay and let's just have, the more you have the better, or be more free in that expression, to we shouldn't be doing it at all, even those people who are married. I mean, chapter 7, it has these extremes, but maybe at the core is some sort of shame that we're dealing with, which is so much a part of being a human being.
Yeah, that's a really good point, how much shame enters that space often. And for us as a church, I feel like to provide a space where shame isn't the dominant narrative is super important in the midst of all of this. So, one of the questions that we want to continue to ask during these times, because we're always wondering, we can't, as communicators, we can't speak about everything that we're discovering in the midst of preparing a sermon. What is something that you had to leave on the cutting room floor this time that you thought, man, I wish I would have been able to get around to talking a little bit deeper about this?
That's a great question. I think maybe on the last point that I was a shorter point, and it says, honor God with your body, and to say maybe to talk more about how we can experience both healing, those of us who need it, which is probably, as I said, most everybody in some way or another, and how we can begin to think about ways that with our body we can be more maybe more careful in these areas, not just for married people, but single people. So maybe more application. Okay. What does it mean to honor God with our body in relative to our sexuality or the desire for sex? That is not just don't do it.
Right.
So, whether that's advice about constructive things that, you probably aren't going to get in a sermon like this, but, because this was more about this. In fact, we don't even know if the people he was talking about were married. We assume it's a mix. That's not really his point.
Right.
Because whether single or married, this behavior seemed to be out of bounds and self-defeating, self-destructive. So, but maybe talking about healthy ways to think about sex, healthy ways to express it, healthy ways to, if sex is done in the body, which is part of Paul's point, how do we, prepare ourselves maybe for a more a meaningful, God-honoring expression? That might have been one thing. I'm thinking, how to encourage, I don't know, to be more hopeful. I don't know, maybe to address more hope, because I that was certainly is my heart. But I can still, thinking back on the sermon, think, boy, there's a lot of heavy truth here. Both in the first, even the first point though, that God is, you have a forever body. I mean, maybe could have talked a little more practically about that. And the third point, but the second point, I think was a heavy point.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'm sitting here realizing, you're single.
Yeah.
I'm married.
Right.
There's two different perspectives to this, and neither one is better than the other. It's just two different perspectives.
Right.
Like, if you were to talk about the practical side of that, like, and what you've learned over the years, what would you bring to that and say, hey, here's what I've learned about this?
Well, I think, from my perspective, I would say it's like I'm trying to think of the where you have a greater respect for something. I want you to respect this automobile, son, before you get in it. Okay, maybe those kind of speeches dads give. Their, whether it's because it can kill you because it's very heavy and it's a dangerous, or I love my Corvette.
Right.
In either case, I want you to respect the power and the beauty and what it means. So that maybe for me, I would say, the more I can respect not not only the gift of sex as God designed it, but the power of it. So that might even go for, I'm dating and I want to be careful. I may end up marrying this woman or this man if I'm a woman, but I mean, whoever I'm in a dating situation, I want to respect that boundary, because sex is a powerful thing. Yeah. Sex is something that has tremendous power. Respect it, so that I don't, even Paul was saying, even this, I mentioned this even in the illustration. Right. That sometimes misadventures, sort of a euphemism for sin, misadventures in sex can haunt us. So I would say I want to respect it. Maybe that means being careful, even pornography, which I didn't even get into.
Right. Yeah.
But pornography is a huge, huge issue, And if I understood better, if we all understood better, you don't have to be a teenager or a young adult to have this mini sermon. If I understood better the power of sex and its giftedness, I might be a lot more cautious on what I might think is a non-risky behavior. So I would think, so respect, I think people having a greater respect for the human body, Paul's first point, or my first point that I was trying to pull out, but also that sex is a beautiful thing, but it's very powerful. And so how do I do a better job, maybe, as I'm thinking whether I'm single, I'm talking about, as you're talking to the audience, or I'm married, or because even if I'm married, it's not only the sense of how I appreciate the sex within my marriage, but the temptations outside of my marriage. Because again, if I think if the attitude that Paul was sort of fighting with in the beginning of the sermon is, you have almost this has almost no real significance. You've looked at the human body as relatively insignificant in the grand scheme. Therefore, you've looked at sexual behavior or sexual engagement as light touch. And those things are what may really set you up for a lot of harm.
Right.
I think Paul's message here is not, you're doing the wrong thing, as much as the wrong thing can be harmful to you. I think it's out of love. Paul speaks many times, as even in these letters, he talks to himself like a father image and a mother image, 1 Thessalonians. He's saying, listen, I love you like my own children. Right. And just like you or I, if I had kids, would want to say, my encouragement to you, even my strong words for you, are out of love, because I don't want you to hurt yourself, or I don't want you to have to damage yourself. And the long answer to your question, sex is a powerful thing. Sex is a gift from God, but it is different than other gifts. That's what I think when he says in that one verse, all sin, not all sin is outside of the body, but he who sins sexually sins against their own body. I'm not saying the passage exactly, but he's saying, listen, in so many words, this is different than other sins, not because God's a prude and he thinks sexual sin is worse than financial sins. I don't think that's what Paul's saying is, because this thing is, by its nature, has more potential. It's more maybe central to who you are, central to how God has made you, and there's more power and therefore greater consequences. Don't play with fire, kind of a thing. So I think he's saying it out of love, and maybe in my own life, I would like to grow with a greater respect for it, and say, I want to make sure I'm honoring the reality of this when I'm around other people, when I'm in a relationship with in my case with a woman, or I'm even with pornography. All of those ways are ways that I can do damage that I think is short term, but that can be much more long term in my life.
Yeah. Wow. Those are all really, really good. So one final question for you, Rob. Let's say someone is listening to this right now and they're feeling like, man, I feel that shame, and I know that's not what we want people to experience. What word of hope would you give them? Yeah.
And it goes back to the very first thing I said, which is the gospel. I hope the gospel is, this is old. This is such an old way of saying it. But it's true. It's bad news, good news. I mean, some people in the church have heard that. Yeah. But in a sense, you might say another way is it's truth and grace. I need to know the truth, and the truth is maybe I have sinned. The truth is maybe I have made mistakes in this area of my life. And we need to acknowledge it, because if we don't acknowledge that, then we're never going to get help.
Right.
But to answer your question, what I'd want people to know is, as Paul ends this passage, you were bought with a price. And he says so much in that one sentence, that Jesus Christ has his sacrifice, his death and resurrection includes the worst of sins. As Jesus said to the thief on the cross, today you're going to be with me in paradise. What a statement. Saying, listen, all of your sin has been covered. And Paul, or the gospel, not only brings the forgiveness of our sin, that's important, but more than that, it brings healing and restoration. It brings hope. It brings new life. It brings people who, I think there's this passage in Ephesians that says, he talks about all these kinds of sins and self-destructive behaviors, including sexual sins. And he says, and such were some of you. But now you have been washed. Now you have been cleansed. Now, these aren't the exact words, but you have been renewed. And the gospel really can bring not just forgiveness, but truly new life, new hope, new power. God really does bring new life to us, and that's what I would say is what I would want people to know. The gospel has tremendous potential. I think it was Corrie ten Boom that said, she made it famous, however deep is the pit, God is deeper still. And that's really true. And I would want people to know, if you have, experienced a lot of brokenness relative to sexual sin, that's not the end of the story. Not only not the end of the story for you, as does Jesus love you, but it's not the end of the story for your ability to have healthy relationships. And people, there are many people, including the story I did share in church, where people who do find true new victory, new life in the area of sex and marriage, and I think I want people to certainly know that.
No, that's great. That's great. Well, thanks, Rob. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that message with us, and thanks for sharing this
time next year. John will be giving this.
That's right. Yeah. Right. Every year, January, it's going to be in the offering or something like that. So anyway, great to have this conversation. Great to have you in this conversation with us, and hopefully we'll see you right back here next week on your computer between two sermons. Thanks.